It was April 30th, 1943. Dust hung heavy in the air at the train yard in central Texas, stirred by a warm wind sweeping across flat fields dotted with mesquite. A long line of boxcars ground to a halt, their brakes hissing like a weary animal. Inside, dozens of German prisoners of war shifted, their bodies tense. They peered through the cracks in the wooden slats, their minds filled with rumors that had chased them across an ocean. They had been told America would humiliate them, starve them, perhaps even parade them through the streets like trophies of war. Their uniforms were stained with the red soil of Tunisia. Their eyes held the vacant stare of men who had marched too far under too many suns. When the heavy doors finally creaked open, the men braced for the expected blows. But instead, they were met with the sight of a vast Texas sky, an expanse so open it seemed to steal the air from their lungs. The soldiers waiting for them wore clean khaki uniforms and looked almost indifferent. As the prisoners stumbled out into the bright light, their boots crunching on the gravel, they anticipated the sting of rifle butts and the harsh bark of orders. But the American guards, many of them barely older than the men they now held captive, simply watched with a calm detachment. Some leaned on their rifles as if this was just another tedious task in the endless grind of the war. A sergeant shielded a lighter from the wind, casually lighting a cigarette with the ease of a man relaxing on his own porch. The scent of burning tobacco, so strangely normal, drifted through the air. For the Germans, whose minds were filled with images of bombed-out cities and starving families, this simple, ordinary moment felt unreal. War was supposed to end in torment, but here it seemed to be dissolving into something mundane. They were marched toward waiting trucks, whispering among themselves. Some were certain it was a trick, that the true cruelty was waiting for them behind the camp gates. Others clutched their few belongings, small pouches, battered helmets, a handful of photographs tucked into coat linings. One young soldier, not yet 19, stared at the horizon. He tried to imagine what captivity in this strange, vast country would be like. Being thousands of miles from the Reich felt like script. They rode on in silence as the countryside rolled by in waves of wheat and cotton. In the distance, the silhouettes of barns and windmills broke the flat horizon. This felt less like punishment and more like an arrival in a land untouched by the horrors they knew. When the convoy finally reached the camp, the men tensed again. Barbed wire fences glittered in the sun, and guard towers stood tall. But even here, the atmosphere was methodical, not menacing. The iron gates opened with a heavy clank, and the prisoners were led inside. They were shown barracks arranged in neat rows, with wooden bunks stacked with clean mattresses and kitchens already steaming with the smell of food. Some of the men blinked, unable to reconcile this sight with the grim future they had been promised. One man whispered, "This isn't war. This is something else." The words felt forbidden, hanging heavy in the air. To admit that an enemy provided more comfort than their own commanders felt like a betrayal. The Americans began processing them, checking names and issuing identification tags. They handed out rule books, the regulations firm but not cruel. The prisoners learned they could send letters, would be paid a small wage for their labor, and would be fed according to international law. As an interpreter translated these rights, the Germans exchanged stunned glances. They had been taught that the Geneva Convention was a fantasy, a useless piece of paper. Yet here it was being enforced by the very people they had sworn to destroy. The irony was bitter, but beneath it something else stirred: confusion, and maybe even a fragile flicker of hope. That evening, the mess hall buzzed with the clatter of plates. The Germans sat at long tables, bracing for the thin soup and stale bread they expected. Instead, steaming trays of meat and potatoes were brought out, along with thick bread, butter, and tender vegetables. The aroma alone was shocking. It was a feast many hadn't tasted in months, richer than the meals their own families were surviving on with ration cards. Some ate with caution, suspecting a trick. Others ate every last bite, their hunger overwhelming their pride. At nearby tables, the guards ate the exact same meal, filled with smoke and murmurs, a surreal energy blurring the line between captor and captive. The prisoners looked at one another, their eyes wide. In that moment, the war raging outside seemed impossibly distant. For some, the taste of beer was the strangest betrayal of all. It didn't taste of victory or defeat. It tasted of humanity, as if the world had decided to be kind, just for one night. Men who had survived desert campaigns and buried comrades in shallow graves now sat under wooden rafters, sipping a drink they thought they would never have again. It was absurd, it was comforting, and it was terrifying. Because if the enemy could be kind, then everything they believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and the fatherland was beginning to crumble. As the lights dimmed and the men returned to their barracks, many lay awake on their clean mattresses, staring at the ceiling. No one spoke of what had happened. The silence was too heavy with unspoken questions. Each man wrestled with the same thought. What did it mean to be treated better by your enemy than by your own leaders? The smell of smoke and food lingered in the rafters. For some, it was the first night in years they would sleep without fear. But beneath the comfort, a deep sense of dread was taking root. If captivity could be this humane, what else had they been wrong about? The first morning in the camp began with a crispness in the air, as the Texas sun burned away the low-lying mist and cast long shadows from the barbed wire fences. The prisoners stirred in their bunks, the softness of the mattresses a lingering surprise, as if the comfort of the night had been a fleeting dream. Some mumbled half-forgotten prayers, while others mechanically adjusted their uniforms, the fabric still stiff with the salt of months of sweat and sea spray. The clang of a bell announced breakfast, and once again, a wave of apprehension went through them. They prepared themselves for watery gruel, but what awaited them was a meal that defied all logic. There was steaming oatmeal, golden scrambled eggs, and bread that was still warm, with a crust that cracked when they broke it. Coffee, strong, bitter, and plentiful, was poured without a hint of stinginess. The men ate with a deliberate slowness at first, their movements half expecting them to vanish like smoke. The ritual of lighting them began in a tense silence. Calloused palms cupped matches against an invisible wind, and men drew in the first breath with a mix of disbelief and relief. Some coughed, the potent American tobacco hitting their lungs harder than they remembered. And then a sound they hadn't heard in ages rose from the tables. Brief, nervous, but genuine laughter. A guard, leaning against the wall, smirked as if he were watching young boys opening Christmas presents. Those cigarettes quickly became more than just tobacco. They were a currency of comfort, a symbol of a dignity they thought was lost forever. An informal economy, born from the desperation of the front lines, immediately reasserted itself within the wire. A man might offer 3 precious smokes for an extra portion of bread. Another would carefully hoard his packs under his mattress, a small treasure in this strange new world. A young corporal with hollow cheeks traded 2 of his cigarettes for a pencil, overcome with a desperate urge to write a letter to a family that might never receive it. What amazed the prisoners most was that the Americans seemed to understand this. They allowed the bartering to happen, perhaps realizing that a man's morale was easier to secure with tobacco than it was with threats. And then, on Sunday evening, came the beer. It was brought out without ceremony, in crates stacked against a wall. The sound of the bottles clinking together was like a chorus of glass bells. The Germans watched in silence as the guards rolled the crates into the hall, prying off the caps with the flat edge of a knife. A flicker of suspicion returned. Was this some cruel trick? Were the bottles filled with something bitter or even poisoned? But as the first sip passed a man's trembling lips, the truth washed over him. It was the unmistakable taste of malt and hops, a flavor that brought back vivid memories of taverns in Bavaria or Hamburg. A profound silence fell over the hall, which was then broken by a wave of murmurs, then chuckles, and finally a roar of laughter that spread like wildfire. One man, his face wet with tears, raised his bottle high in a toast. Wire. The battle was no longer for survival. It was a battle for their beliefs. What did it mean when the monsters from the propaganda films handed you comfort in the form of smoke and ale? Personal diaries, written in careful, deliberate pencil strokes, captured these moments of profound confusion. One prisoner scribbled, "Beer in the land of the enemy. It is impossible, and yet it is here, in my hand. At home, our families starve. Here, we feast." Another wrote about trading cigarettes for a bar of soap, and then trading that soap for a comb, marveling at how such small, simple luxuries could feel like salvation. These fragile scraps of testimony, fragments of pure astonishment, would outlast the war itself. Even the Americans couldn't ignore the irony. The guards joked among themselves that their captives were eating better than their own wives back home, where ration coupons strictly limited sugar, butter, and meat. For some of the guards, especially the farm boys who knew their own families were scraping by, the contrast was a source of bitter resentment. But orders were orders, and the principles of the Geneva Convention were a greater priority. The United States had made a calculated decision to follow the rules, not just for moral reasons, but for pragmatic ones. If German POWs were treated well here, it increased the chances that American soldiers captured in Europe might receive the same. Still, this generosity was not without its dangers. The cigarettes and beer loosened tongues. In the quiet corners of the barracks, stories began to spill out, stories of fear, of doubt, and of commanders who had led them into unwinnable battles and left them to die. In whispered German, they began to question if their sacrifice had any meaning at all, when the enemy treated them with more respect than their own regime. Some argued fiercely that it was all a sophisticated trick, a way to break their will. But others countered that the only trick was the propaganda they had been fed back home. The mess hall had become a crucible, a place where ideology was being melted down and reformed in the intense heat of this contradiction. By the middle of summer in 1943, the contradictions had become a permanent feature of life behind the barbed wire. The camp moved with a rhythm from the slow, relentless collapse of the beliefs they had carried across the ocean. The propaganda that had once been their scripture painted Americans as decadent, cowardly brutes who relied on machines because they lacked true spirit. But the guards they saw every day were not monsters. They were young farmers, clerks, and students, their shoulders squared under their khaki uniforms, their rifles held with a casual confidence. They were ordinary, and that very ordinariness was a more powerful weapon than any form of torture. Watching them toss a baseball in the evenings, a cigarette dangling from the corner of a mouth, was more destabilizing than a beating could ever have been. The enemy, it turned out, looked frustratingly, undeniably human. Books began to appear in the camp library, donated by people from nearby towns. Some were in German, others in English. At first, the prisoners eyed them with suspicion, convinced there was a trick hidden within the printed pages. But boredom is its own kind of hunger, and soon men were cautiously thumbing through volumes of Goethe and Schiller, the words a bittersweet taste of a home they might never see again. Some even attempted to decipher the strange grammar of English from primers. The guards, with a mixture of amusement and curiosity, would sometimes pause to correct their pronunciation. Words once shouted in the heat of battle were now being exchanged with a shared smile over a simple book. In the dusty yard, Americans tried to explain the bizarre and complicated rules of baseball. In return, the Germans taught them the fluid strategies of soccer. The field became an impossible stage, where laughter echoed across languages, a sound of simple joy that was a quiet act of treason to the ideologies that had brought them there. These discoveries found their way into letters home, though the heavy black lines of the censors obscured the details. Still, hints slipped through. One prisoner wrote, "We eat better here than our families do at home." Another confessed, "The Americans do not treat us as beasts. They treat us as men." For some, these admissions tore holes in the fabric of their loyalty, forcing them to reconcile what they were living with what they had been taught. Others clung even more fiercely to their ideology, insisting that the generosity, small yet so piercing, shook the foundations of hatred more than any grand speech ever could. One man would later confess that he thought of that apple more often than he thought of the medals pinned to his chest. Kindness, he had discovered, was far harder to resist than cruelty. Yet, not all succumbed so easily. In some barracks, the die-hard loyalists kept a close watch, reporting anyone they suspected of wavering to the prisoner leaders who still held on to their faith in the Reich. Fights broke out. Arguments flared, with men shouting themselves hoarse as they defended an ideology that was losing its grip with every passing week of humane treatment. The internal conflict grew sharper. Could you still call yourself a soldier if you admitted the enemy's humanity? Could loyalty survive the undeniable evidence of your own senses? For men who had built their entire identity on obedience, these questions were dangerous, even lethal. As winter crept into Texas, a mild chill that felt like spring to men who had survived the frozen Eastern Front, news of the war began to filter through the wire. By late 1944, the tide had clearly turned. The Americans said little, but the prisoners could read defeat in the grim headlines of newspapers the guards left behind. Stalingrad, Normandy, the relentless push toward the Rhine. The names were whispered in the barracks, each one a nail in the coffin of a collapsing Reich. And yet, inside the camp, the routine continued. Meals were served on time, cigarettes were distributed, and on holidays, beer still appeared. A quiet promise that humanity had not been entirely extinguished by the war. The longer they stayed, the more the camp became a strange mirror, distorting their old loyalties. Men who had once saluted a swastika now found themselves humming American tunes they heard on the guards' radios. The propaganda that had once thundered with absolute certainty now seemed brittle and hollow against the quiet weight of persistent kindness. When the war in Europe finally ended in May of 1945, the announcement was met not with cheers, but with a stunned, heavy silence. The gates would finally open, but relief was tangled with a profound sense of sorrow. They longed for home, but they knew that home was now offered him one with a grin, shattering the wall of hatred he had built around his heart. These men became storytellers, passing on their incredible tales to their children and grandchildren, shaping how post-war generations understood the complex nature of both enemy and ally. On a larger scale, America's treatment of its prisoners became a case study in the power of principle. By upholding the Geneva Convention, the United States had shown that decency could be a strategic asset. Reports later suggested that thousands of Allied POWs in Germany benefited as a result, as German authorities, aware of how their own soldiers were being treated abroad, hesitated to break the rules too openly. The chain of kindness stretched across oceans, its logic rooted not just in morality, but in reciprocity. And yet, Beneath the historical records and government documents lay the quieter, more powerful truth. It was the human details that endured. The clink of beer bottles on a warm summer night, the shared glow of cigarettes as men sat shoulder to shoulder, enemies bound by a silence more intimate than any speech. The taste of food that reminded them not of war, but of life. These were the moments that rewrote convictions, not through force, but through the disarming power of ordinary humanity. On their final night in the camp, as the last lights went out, the men lay awake, knowing they would soon step beyond the fences for the last time. Some whispered prayers. Others smoked their last rationed cigarettes in silence, the embers glowing in the darkness like tiny flames burning against a vast and uncertain future. They could not have known then how their memories would shape lives for decades to come, how a simple kindness offered in captivity would echo across generations. But as the smoke curled upward, disappearing into the rafters, one truth lingered in every breath. The war had taught them how to fear, but their captivity in America had taught them something far more dangerous to carry home. It had taught them how to doubt,